And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. She's an award-winning journalist, and her book, Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment, is the first to take an in-depth look at abuse and neglect enabled by religious belief. It's a very important topic, and I hope you will join me in giving her a warm welcome to the stage. Please welcome Janet Heimlich.
Thank you, Michael and Bobby, for having me. I really appreciate you just extending this invitation to me and to bringing this issue into light so that we all can start to become not only more aware of it, but also to discuss it more openly. And I think that that has been happening, at least in this country, but it seems like it's taken a very long time for people to even acknowledge that religion can be harmful to children. In my book, I don't make any kind of statement that it's always bad for children, although there are those who believe that. But I feel like it's very difficult for many Americans to look at religion as going both ways. Certainly when I was just doing my research and talking to various people on the topic, oh, it just might be someone's secretary who got into a discussion with me about it while we're waiting for someone else to get on the phone. And, you know, the individual, without even batting an eye, would immediately say, well, you know, when children are abused, religion has nothing to do with it. It's really just the sick, sadistic individuals that are causing the problem. The more that I researched it, I realized that, well, yeah, there are those situations where certain individuals are going to be abusive or neglectful of children, regardless of the influences. But if you really look at so many cases of abuse and neglect where religion has somehow infused the situation, you'll see that there are some common themes that run through a lot of these cases. And that's what I learned, regardless of whether the religious influence was Christian-based or Jewish-based, Islam-based. It really didn't matter. So when asking this question, can religion really be bad for kids? We should acknowledge that sometimes it's great for children, but we can't just remain in that camp and be in denial about the fact that it's also harmful at times. The other thing that I tried to do with my book was differentiate just when is religion harmful to children, and we'll get into that in a second. One woman that I have come to admire because of a lot of the writings she's done, and she's a professor of law at Cardozo School of Law, Marcy Hamilton, wrote a book called God versus the Gavel, and she looks specifically at crimes that are committed that are in some way religiously motivated. And she devotes a chapter to crimes against children. And what she says in her book, the United States has a romantic attitude toward religious individuals, as though they are always doing what is right. The unrealistic belief that religion is always for the good is a hazardous myth. Horrible things that have been done to children beneath the cloak of religion. Sorry, there's a typo in there. Children have been raped, beaten, and permitted to die excruciating deaths. I felt that it was important to actually give what I was writing about a name. I had read books, I had done interviews with experts and that kind of thing, where many people have tried to get at this issue. Some had coined phrases like religious child abuse or abuse by religion and some other names, but they really didn't describe what it is we're talking about. I use the term maltreatment because maltreatment includes both abuse and neglect, and it's important to recognize that neglect is the most pervasive form of maltreatment, regardless of what kind of influence is going on. And I devote a large chapter, actually a large section of my book, to religious medical neglect, because that seems to be a pervasive and serious problem. I define religious child maltreatment as child abuse or neglect that is enabled by religious beliefs held by perpetrators or their surrounding community. Examples of religious child maltreatment include justifying physical abuse with scripture or doctrine, and you'll hear a great deal about that from Bethany, who's going to speak after I do. Using one's religious status to sexually abuse children and procure their silence. Spurning, terrorizing, or exploiting victims with religious messages. Those are all forms of psychological maltreatment. Indoctrinating, isolating, presenting a very narrow religious worldview to children. Failing to provide needed medical care due to beliefs about faith healing or divine intervention. Failing to report abuse to protect the image of a religion, faith leader, or religious community. As I said before, I felt it was important to not just point out problems that exist in faith communities, but to actually differentiate between abuse that can happen in any kind of community and those that happen in specific religious sects, places of worship, or communities. And I really battled. This was a big struggle for me to really get to the bottom of it. You know, when is one child in one kind of faith community at risk for religious child maltreatment and a child in another community not? I certainly don't make the point that there isn't abuse or neglect that happens in secular communities. But when you're looking specifically at religiously motivated abuse, when are children at the most risk? And what I concluded was that children who were raised in religious authoritarian cultures, culture could be a home or place of worship, Bible camp, yeshiva, any kind of religious facility or community or home where children are raised and their welfare is in the hands of those who are pious. When those cultures are authoritarian, then children are at significantly more risk than if there's less authoritarian influences going on. The way that I defined a religious authoritarian culture is, it comes down to like a three-pronged approach. The three perfect storm characteristics, if you will, are that the culture maintains a strict social hierarchy. So you may have religious leaders that have way more power than the membership. Almost always men have much more power than women. Children are denied really any rights whatsoever. The culture is unusually fearful. There are many fear-based teachings in the culture, whether they're theological or otherwise. And thirdly, the culture is socially separatist. We'll get into more about how that causes problems. But I still was wondering, like, how do we tie the two together? Why, or exactly how does a religious authoritarian culture affect children? I just really was having trouble connecting those two together until I had dinner with a friend of mine who raised her children in the Church of Jehovah's Witnesses. And at that dinner, she handed me this book written by Margaret Sanger called Cults in Our Midst. And she said, "You're not going to understand how this works until you understand about cults." And I hadn't decided, I really didn't want to go in that direction. I didn't want to have anything to do with cults in my book because I thought that it would turn people off and steer people away from the issue, thinking that, well, cults really are very fringy, weird people that worship aliens and things like that. And it doesn't apply to me. And but she was right. It wasn't until I got to the chapter on children in that book that I really understood how this happens. And this is what Margaret Sanger wrote. Cult children are powerless. They are total victims. Even the parents on whom they should be able to depend are controlled by the cult leader. and thus the children's fate is in his hands. In cults, parents do not function as they do in the regular world. They are more like middle management personnel in a business. The cult leader dictates how children are to be reared, and the parents simply implement these orders. So what she's saying is, the cult leadership controls the children through the parents. And that is what I have seen take place, maybe not always to the extreme that happens in cults, what I consider to be the most totalitarian type of groups. But that same dynamic happens in any religious authoritarian community. And again, I think you'll hear more of that from Bethany, and you, I think, will hear more of how that plays out in what I'm going to continue talking about. The worst case of religious child maltreatment that I think we've ever seen happened in 1978, when more than 900 people in the People's Temple in Jonestown, Guyana were killed or committed suicide. Jim Jones was the cult leader of this group, and this was and still continues to be a very painful episode in our history, I think, especially for those who, well, certainly for those who survived this incident or were in some way connected to, had loved ones in this group. What people don't know about Jonestown is that prior to the killings, there were egregious abuses happening against adults and to children. And there's a book that was written on this called The Children of Jonestown, which details some of those abuses. This was by far, I mean, as totalitarian a culture you can get. And everyone that was involved with this paid a price for being involved in it. There were henchmen who carried out Jim Jones's orders. They were holding rifles on the people during that time. So when the media first portrayed the final day of Jonestown as a mass suicide, it was really out of ignorance, because it was only later that they learned that there were these rifles pointed at the community. Although there were many people that did willingly take their lives. And as I said, a third of the people that died were children, babies, toddlers, children, and teenagers. So it was hardly the Heaven's Gate kind of situation that many people initially thought. There was actually a recording, an audio recording that was done during the time that all these people were losing their lives, and I quote from that in my book. Many cult leaders are so self-grandized, they're so in love with themselves that they oftentimes will document everything that they do. Warren Jeffs, who's the leader of the FLDS, the Fundamentalist Church, Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the polygamist Mormon group in West Texas that was raided. When he was caught, I mean, you know, they had boxes and boxes and boxes of his journals and so forth, and all of his audio recordings, and Jim Jones was the same way. But there was actually a particular time when Jim Jones, from what you hear, just from what he's saying, was in the process of convincing a woman to kill her child by injecting flavor aid laced with cyanide into the child's mouth. And you can hear from what he says, and again, you can read this quote in the book, that he's successful in convincing her to murder her child. I'll just kind of whiz through some of these things. There are problematic beliefs that exist in religious authoritarian cultures that lead to all kinds of problems. The idea that children should honor parents unconditionally, that the Bible requires that parents spank their children, oftentimes to break the child's will, which has the goal of ridding them of sin and thereby making them more heaven-worthy. Disobedient children will suffer in the afterlife. Children are sinful. Abuse victims should forgive their perpetrators. Religious leaders can do no wrong. The faithful must avoid scandal at all costs. Sexual feelings and actions are sinful, especially outside of marriage. Adult child sex or adult child marriage is an expression of piety. And you will see that in a few groups, such as the FLDS that I mentioned, with their practice of underage marriage. Faith healing is superior to medical care. Evil spirits can take over the body, and I do devote a chapter of my book to child ritual abuse. And since I'm focusing on this country, which the vast majority of people in this country who are religious happen to be Christians, so when it comes to ritual abuse in the United States, I found the most pervasive form of that to be exorcism, where they are trying to purge children's bodies of evil spirits and demons and Satan, that kind of thing. God wants parents to have many children. Females must be pure. An example of that, well, it comes up in all these cultures, but with the growing Islamic immigrant population, we have been seeing more cases of honor killings in this country. There was just one trial that took place in Canada where several people in a family were convicted of being responsible for the murder of 4 people. 3 of them, I think, were minors. I have that right. And then there was a case in Dallas not too long ago, 2 girls who were allegedly killed by their father due to the fact that they were found to be dating non-Muslim boys, acting Western and that kind of thing. And so the idea that females must be pure, I see as being problematic in Islamic authoritarian communities. The reason why those killings take place, and also severe corporal punishment, because it usually is something that progresses from emotional maltreatment to physical punishment, and then on to sometimes causing their deaths, has to do with the fact that because the females are not acting in a pure way, they have dishonored the family. There are many challenges to investigating cases of religious child maltreatment, and I think I just want to focus on one, which is the problem of initially the cases not getting reported. So Child Protective Services, law enforcement, and other agencies that are there to help protect children from abuse don't even find out about the cases. This seems to be the #1 problem. I'm going to talk a little bit about Orthodox Jewish communities, but this really does apply across the board regardless of the brand of religion. Some of the ideological obstacles, the belief systems in these communities that prevent these crimes to be learned about and investigated. Outsiders are out to persecute us. Oftentimes there's a narcissism that happens where the believers think that they possess the one truth, and that anyone else on the outside is misguided, evil, and that having too much interaction with outsiders will then adulterate the purity of the group. And there's a lot of fear that children are raised with regarding anyone who's a non-believer. The group believes that they obey God's laws, which they consider to be above secular law. We must protect ourselves from scandal at all costs, and we've seen that certainly in the Catholic Church, but again, it really runs through all religious organizations. I haven't found one religious institution that openly and without question tells the membership to report suspected cases of child abuse and neglect to authorities. They oftentimes will insert some sort of intermediary that's run by the religious organization that somehow filters whether or not the cases should be reported. In Orthodox Jewish communities, one form of that is the Shamrim, which is a voluntary police organization. Most of these people are not certified or trained in law enforcement or investigating child abuse cases, but they do know the neighborhood very well. They speak Yiddish. When there's problems in the community that are related to crime, most people in Orthodox Jewish communities are going to make their first call to the Shamrim. And you may remember the case of Leiby Kletsky, who was the 8-year-old boy in Brooklyn who was kidnapped and murdered. His mother waited hours before she notified police about his disappearance. She first called the Shamrim. So there are some that feel like there was valuable time that was wasted there. Certainly the Shamrim do a lot to help the community, but at the same time they have been accused of being somewhat of a vigilante group, beating up people who are non-Jewish that they believe have harmed members of the community. They also sometimes will sit on information of known child molesters and not report that information to police. And in fact, the Shamrim did have some information on the man who was convicted of murdering Leiby Kletsky. And so again, there were concerns about the fact that perhaps his murder could have been averted had they worked more closely with police. However, I just need to repeat that just about every religious group and organization does have their own internal way of, quote, prosecuting and investigating crimes against children. Unfortunately, they're largely ineffective of getting victims counseling and bringing justice, having the perpetrators be held accountable. This is a quote written in an op-ed by a man I've come to know. His name is Rabbi Gary Moskowitz, and he is a former member of the New York City Police Department. He's been an outspoken critic of rabbinical councils who tell members of the Orthodox Jewish community to, if they do suspect abuse or neglect, not to report those cases immediately to police or child protective services. Instead, the rabbis say that they are more qualified to determine whether or not those cases should be made known to outsiders. They sometimes will say that it violates Jewish law for those people to go outside of the group, and that's been a really big problem with the reporting of cases. And so this is what he wrote in his op-ed. And you certainly have heard this same statement made to, for example, priests that enter the Catholic Church and decide to devote themselves to that line of work, as well as many other religious institutions. Pedophiles and domestic batterers have a good life knowing that there is little chance their victim will come forward out of fear of the community's religious psychological terror campaign against anyone who threatens the ban of approaching the secular courts or the press. One issue that I talk a lot about and I write a lot about is Americans' concerns that their religious rights are going to be taken away. I don't quite know where this comes from, but this seems to be a huge issue, and we certainly hear about it now with the current political climate where people are willing to do just about anything or say that they would do just about anything to maintain their religious rights. The reason why I have this photograph of Amish children is because the Supreme Court decided a number of decades ago that the Amish had the right to take their children out of high school because they were Amish. The Amish attorneys convinced the justices that they could not maintain their culture in the way that they wanted to and educate their children through senior year of high school. So while kids across the country, we determine by law, have a right to a high school education, we essentially deny that right to the Amish because the Amish feel that that would somehow prevent them from maintaining the purity of their culture. This is a girl named Madeline Newman, excuse me. Her name was Madeline Newman, but people refer to her as Kara. Kara Newman died at the age of 11 from diabetes. She hadn't been taken to a doctor since she was 3 years old, so her diabetes was never diagnosed. And her parents, who led a small Christian-based church, didn't believe in medical care and decided instead to pray for her. Her father, by the way, formerly had been a police officer. So she suffered greatly the last few weeks of her life as her body went into diabetic coma. And her parents were ultimately convicted in her death, although they were not given much of a sentence at all because her state, that of Wisconsin, had what many states have, which is a religious exemption, which prevents parents of children who die from religious medical neglect from either being prosecuted or being punished in the same way that other parents would be punished whose children die of medical neglect. And to this day, Wisconsin still has not repealed its religious exemption due to the fact that the Christian Science Church has lobbied against that. This is a quote by the mayor of Lake City, Florida, back in 1990, when he became upset at his constituents for being wary of a religious group called End Time Ministry that wanted to move into the community. The reason why his constituents were wary is because it was a zealous faith healing group in which a baby had died from an untreated nosebleed. And Mayor Witt was, as I said, incensed that this group was not being warmly welcomed into his city, and made this statement to the press: "It's maybe necessary for some babies to die to maintain our religious freedoms. It may be the price we have to pay. Everything has a price." Excuse me, I'm going to just zip through. The Supreme Court did try to draw the line between where religious rights leave off and children's rights begin. And so this was part of a decision that was made concerning a case involving a Jehovah's Witness adult, a woman who wanted to have a child go with her and pass out pamphlets. As you can see, this was back in 1944. I don't think the current Supreme Court would make the same decision. And the Supreme Court decision involving the Amish that I talked about earlier came quite a bit after this one. The right to practice religion freely does not include the liberty to expose the community or child to ill health or death, is what the court decided. In my book, I do bring up a long list of potential solutions to combating religious child maltreatment. One thing I talk about, and I think this is probably the most important solution, which really falls on the shoulders of parents who are raising their kids in places of worship and faith communities, to question whether or not that community is authoritarian. So I provide a number of questions that parents can ask themselves that might help them determine whether or not their community is authoritarian. I'm just going to read a few of them to you. Is my faith community theologically exclusive? Does my community fear or hold in contempt those who are not part of our faith? Do I feel at ease asking questions, voicing complaints, or expressing feelings of religious doubt to those in authority or others? Do my faith leaders tell us God wants us to spank our kids? Are children in my place of worship treated respectfully, even when they misbehave, or are they made to feel shameful? If parents or children need help managing their lives, does my place of worship offer suggestions for mental health services, or simply tell them to talk to a member of the clergy, pray harder, or undergo an exorcism? And these are some questions for discussion. And I think what I'll do is just perhaps leave that up on the screen. I wanted to mention to you, I have an email list sign up that's outside. So if you want to stay in touch with me about any of this stuff, if you want to receive my blogs and that kind of thing, please please feel free to sign up for that. And what I'd like to do now is introduce Bethany Brittain, who has come down here from the Bay Area of California to talk to you about her personal story. And the way that I found this person was through the internet. I can't remember just what I was searching for. That, and I guess if you need lights or something, we're not going to be using the slideshow after this, so we don't need to darken the house lights. But I was probably researching like Christian-based theologies regarding spanking or something like that. I came across a document that was put online called An Open Letter to Roy Lessin. Roy Lessin was a religious leader of a church who wrote a couple of books on spanking. He infused religious beliefs, doctrine, and that kind of thing, biblical passages, with his teachings about spanking. And I guess that's probably what led me to it, because I had been writing about Roy Lessin. And Bethany had written a letter that was directed to Mr. Lessin, but it was for the public to read. And I was really moved when I read this letter. I think she may read parts of it when she comes up here. I did find her through writing to the owner of the website who had posted the letter. Her letter, by the way, is also posted on as a review of Roy Lessin's books, which is, I think, a great place for it to appear. And I had the pleasure of being able to not just speak to Bethany, but interview her for my book. And I thought it was one of the most insightful interviews that I conducted. She taught me a great deal about what it's like for a child who's raised in a religious authoritarian community by parents who were followers, authoritarian followers, and then who go on to raise their children in ways that they believe is a way to obey God. And it's a very moving story. I'm just so pleased to have her here, and so I'd like to introduce her now to you, Bethany Brittain.
Hi, thanks for having me today. I'm happy to be a part of the group and a part of this discussion. Well, my story, you'd think it would begin the year that I was born in 1968, but it doesn't. It begins a few years earlier, about 1965. My mom and my dad meet, and my mom has a profound God experience and becomes a devout Christian. And in the process, she leads my father, who would be the man who would be my father, to Christ. And she leads my grandparents and her sisters. And so a family that was once secular becomes devout Christians. And as my parents get married and start a life with the prospect of children and all that comes with that, they really wanted to serve God. They wanted to understand what it meant to be Christian. And my father, in particular, coming from a military background, a very short military background, really wants to raise children and have obedient children, children you can take places and they don't get into things and they obey immediately. So my mother finds a book, and I can't tell you what the book's name was, but it involved corporal punishment. And she reads the book, and as soon as I'm born, I'm the oldest of actually 4 children. I'm born, and when I'm 6 months old, I received my first spanking. And in the community I come from, spanking is a very distinct word that I have a hard time using. And so for today's discussion, I'm going to change that word to beating, and I'll explain why in a moment. My mother is taking care of me and puts me down for an afternoon nap. And she notices that when she lays me down, I turn bright red and I scream, and my arms and legs are rigid. And she has this epiphany as she looks at me that this is a human being, although be it small, is sinful. I am rebelling against her wishes to take a nap. And my rebellion is incredibly strong. And so my mother checks my diaper to make sure that I have nothing poking me, and realizes that this is the time that it is her job to rid me of my natural sin, the sin that I was born with. So she removes my diaper, and with some sort of implement, she spanks me or beats me, and she clothes me again and puts me down, and I scream again. And she repeats the process for maybe 2 to 3 or 4 times. I don't know. I don't actually know this story or remember this story, and the only reason I have it here to share with you is that my mother was often an outspoken woman in her community about what it meant to raise godly children, and would use this story again and again to show that no child can be too young to experience sin and rebellion. And that's how I know the story. So before I go on with my story, let me define for you what a beating, or in my old community's way of wording it, a spanking was. This is from the open letter that I wrote to Roy. The first step is to use the right instrument. If a parent uses their hand, the child might become fearful the child might become fearful of the parent's hand. The second step is to spank promptly. The third step is to find a private place in which a parent can conduct the spanking. The fourth step is for a parent to explain to a child why they are going to be spanked. The fifth step is to get a child into a good spanking position. You could recommend that a child bend over a bed, grab their ankles, or hang onto a dresser. And in my letter, as an aside, Shar, which is Roy's wife, when we met them, Shar was also responsible for spanking me. So in my letter, we were instructed, or my parents were instructed, to disrobe us. So during the spanking ritual, we were undressed and in a submissive position. So obviously, I was a baby, 6 months old, so some of those steps did not apply, but as I grew older, they did. And it's important to understand the fundamental principles that my parents drew from in order to live godly lives and lead us to also live godly lives. They believe that the Bible is inerrant and that the Bible is a direct word from God and needs no interpretation, but is a manual of sorts for how to live their lives. And they believed that all people, including themselves, are born sinful and need to rely on the blood of Jesus Christ in order to become saved. They also believed that this world was going to be short, that there was a second coming of Christ, although they didn't know when, but that was a constant conversation both in my Christian community and in my home about Jesus Christ returning soon. Between 1968 and 1970, my mother has 3 children. And we are really small by the time we ended up in Los Angeles, in this area, and we meet Roy and Shar and a few other men who create a church and publishing company called Outreach Publications. The church has since moved to Siloam Springs, Arkansas, and the publishing sector of that group is now owned by Hallmark. My father was an illustrator, and he worked for the publishing company, as Roy also created cards and heartfelt inspiration for Christian community. The church and the publishing company thought it important to bring the good news of Christ. You have to understand that in the year I was born, it was a pretty tough year for Americans. We were in the midst of a Vietnam. There were lots of people who were rebelling. Lots was happening. And so my parents in the church outreach was looking around them and saying the uncertainty and the lack of Christianity was big. And they thought that the time of the end times were near and wanted to get out the good news. In my home, the mission that my parents had was fairly simple. At least they thought. They asked 3 things of us. They asked us to obey them without question. They asked us to obey quickly. Slow disobedience was not obedience. And they asked us to always obey with a good attitude, a happy attitude. I can tell you that as a child, I was uncertain of my attitude or how it would be read. I found myself living in what I like to call my happy obedience shell. It didn't matter what was happening to me. I knew that living outside and allowing my true feelings to be known was dangerous, and thus I kept it to myself. I wanted to give you guys some examples of things that we were beaten for. I remember my father washing my hair and soap would get in my eyes, and so I would cry, and his thought process was that I wasn't trusting him. And so after a few hair washings, they began beating me for crying. We were all spanked, and I make a point when I speak, as this is my first time, but when I communicate or write about my story, that I leave my brother's stories for them to tell. But I will say that all 3 of us experienced deeply profound fear, mostly fear of our bedrooms and a fear of sleeping. And so my parents would put us to bed, and they did not tolerate the ritual of, can I get a glass of water, or I need to go to the bathroom. Once we were put in bed, we were expected to stay there. So becoming fearful of my bedroom was at first okay, but as time grew on, it was no longer okay because I was lacking trust in my father and thus in God. So I was beaten for being afraid. We were beaten if we were told to pick up something, and we had to be reminded more than once. I remember a red purse with a bird on the front that was laying on the bathroom floor. Something exciting was happening in my life at that moment, and I heard the stern voice of my father call 3 of us back to the bathroom, and it was my red purse amongst the towels and clothing, and I was beaten. I remember hating the purse. I remember being ill or sick and was not allowed to be grumpy or disrespectful. Honoring your father and mother was important in all things. I have to tell you, when I was asked to come here and speak to all of you, my biggest fear was this would resemble something of a church. I, to this day, do not go to church. When outreach publications would meet, the church aspect would meet, it was very common for children to be screaming and crying and to know that they were being beaten. It was very difficult to witness my brother's beatings, and it was difficult to witness anyone else's beatings. Things that we would be beaten in church for was we were to sit still and listen as adults and open our hearts and our minds to God's word. And so fidgeting was not allowed, and I often didn't know how much fidgeting I may have caused during the time I sat there. So my butt would get sore, as you can imagine, we're kids, and I move a little to the right and wait what I think and I hope is enough time, and then move a little to the left and hope the service didn't last too much longer. Unfortunately, we didn't know at the time of movement if we were in trouble or not. It was usually the car ride home. So getting the social aspect of church afterwards was a little anxiety-ridden, I should say. And it would be the car ride home that my mother would say, "You kids were disgraceful, you moved too much." And we would wonder which one of us were in for it. I remember one such beating that took place, and the 3 of us were lined up, undressed, and made to stand while my mother beat us for moving in church. On one such occasion, when I was little, I had to have been about between the age of 4 and 6. A parent had a child outside. I believe the child was 2, but my memory could be incorrect. It was a small child, and the parents were beating the child outside. The church was held in a home, so we were in a residential area, and one of the neighbors called the cops. And the sirens were blaring outside, and the officers came to the door, And Roy Lesson picked up his Bible and rushed out to explain the good news of Christ and what it meant to raise godly children to the police officers. I was so ashamed, I sat in my chair and silently prayed the officers would take the child away. They did not. I was disappointed that I was born a girl. It was not something I wanted. Being born a girl meant that, albeit I was being submissive and my brothers were being submissive to my parents, being a girl meant I would be submissive for life. I was never encouraged to think about a career or think about my interests. I was being groomed to be married and have lots of children for God and to follow my husband. The women in the church that I belonged to, if they were single mothers, were instructed to follow the men of the church, and they were their head of households. The Bible had comfort for some in my church, but it had little comfort for me, and let me tell you why. The very first story that I remember learning, although the Old Testament was full of stories I didn't understand, the Abraham and Isaac story was very difficult for me as a child. I remember being in Sunday school and I was coloring a picture of Isaac laying hands bound on an altar while Abraham, his father, had a knife poised above his heart and an angel of God was standing somewhere out of sight. I colored the picture and took it home, and a few days later went to my dad's studio where he was doing his art. I like to sit and talk to my father, and so I wanted to understand what would happen if God asked him to sacrifice me. My father was nervous. He laughed and said something about children being so innocent and asking the tough questions. Then he said to me, "I would hope God would never ask me to sacrifice you." But I would have to say that if God did ask me to sacrifice you, that I would have to be obedient and trust God with my faith that he had something better in mind. I went to sleep that night feeling afraid, a fear that would never leave me. The other Bible story that is mindful to me is a story of Jesus. I liked Jesus. He was actually nice to women. He had many stories that would allow me to feel, I felt very personal with Jesus. And then I came across the story on an Easter Sunday about him being crucified. I grieved for days and days, as if I had lost a family member. I didn't understand why it was such a good news to talk to people about Jesus dying on the cross for our sins. After all, Jesus came back, they told me. There's nothing to cry about. Ah, but he walks through walls. It's not the same. The third story that really is mindful to me and has caused me nightmares to this very day is the idea of the returning of Christ. There were many different views in my community about Jesus would show up and we would all go into heaven, and then there was the stories of no, that the humanist, and I realize that that's a loaded term, but the humanist on the outside world would eventually cave into communism and then eventually into end times, and we would all go through trials and tribulations together. We would be tortured and persecuted as Christians. And so I remember this one particular night while I was at church. I was 5, by the way. I know that because I had kindergarten clothes that my mother had just bought me laying on my bed. So in church on a Sunday night, there was a movie they played called A Thief in the Night. I've tried really hard to go online and look at the movie again, but I cannot. The song that went with the movie was titled, "I Wish We'd All Been Ready." In that song, I can sing you the words, and I will not because it's very painful and difficult to get out of my head. I remember the film had people, loved ones, whisked away while others stayed behind. And I didn't understand why, if we said the sinner's prayer and we were spared from hell, why it was that I was continually spanked. Saying I'm sorry didn't cause me any less grief. So I never really thought that I was saved and I never really trusted. Well, those are my early childhood moments that I'm sharing with you, but something happened by the time I was 12. It was a progression that was slow at first. My mother reading books to better my father and her spiritual life, had learned that white sugar and white flour are bad and had changed our diet. Now there was even more things that we could get in trouble for. We became a little bit more secluded from the church, that outreach publications actually. And at some point my mother had read that modern medicine was actually bad and couldn't be trusted, nor could the school system, again run by humanists and not necessarily the kind that was going to be accepting of them. My little sister, who's 11 and a half years younger, was born at home. I would have been in 7th grade when they pulled me out of school. I was the oldest, so I had more school experience than my siblings. We stayed home and we worked on our books and we worked on our math, and I didn't understand science. We had a science that was a Mennonite science book that talked about minerals and how women adorning themselves with gold were sinful. I had no interest in science. We read literature books, which I did find interest in. I was way behind in math. My time in my education, I was born dyslexic. I now understand what that means, but I didn't at the time. So I would often find myself beaten for getting letters backwards or misspelling or not understanding math. So as this exodus to the Promised Land began to take shape, my parents moved to Northern California. And they had a revelation that they called, it was like the Israelites finding the Promised Land. And so we lived in a 21-foot trailer, and we lived in tents, and we became people who lived close to the ground, and eventually landed a little piece of property and at some point built a house. I was the oldest and felt very responsible for my siblings, and I gave a lot of care to my sister. I got up with her at night, I took care of her when she was sick, and I entertained her and took care of her during the day. My mother was gone a lot, so I spent a lot of time cleaning house and keeping everybody in line. I don't think my brothers appreciate it, but my sister does. At some point, my father noticed that I was doing a lot of caretaking of my sister and thought, this is important to teach Bethany how to spank Dorinda. He sat me down and explained the Roy lesson spanking ritual, which I had already known since I had so many years of experience. I remember that I spanked my sister 2 to 3 times. I hope that I'll never know for sure if it was 4. I remember the look on her face when I would tell her that she was in trouble and she would be receiving a spanking, and she was 6 when I left home, so she was 4 or 5. Sorry, this is hard to share. I would say, Dorinda, you are in trouble for doing this, and I would explain what she had done wrong, and then I would take her and undress her, and I would bend her in a submissive position, and I would hit her. The look on her face was utter terror. I knew, without a doubt, that that little girl would do anything I asked of her. I was in complete and utter control. The last time I spanked her, she looked at me with her eyes blue. She was terrified. I could not spank her again. I wrapped her in my arms, and I promised her that I would never hit her ever again. I don't know how many times I've asked her to forgive me. I remember I left home at 18. I was planning my escape to my extended family way before I was 18. I was thinking about life in the world outside that I feared, and I had no idea how to ask for a job. I had no idea what it meant to be a citizen out there. And before I left, there was an incident where my father was beating my sister, and I was wearing the watch he gave me when I was 16 for my 16th birthday, and I couldn't stand listening to her. I couldn't stand listening to the cries of my siblings. And I watched as the minutes ticked by, and at the 11th minute, I could stand it no longer. I rushed towards my mother, and I said, "I'm going to get him off of her." And she said, "Young lady, you will not. He is your father, and he knows what he's doing." I was unable to save her. I was spanked for the first time when I was 6 months old, and the last time when I was 13. My middle brother was spanked from his infancy as well until he was about 14 or 15. And my little brother was spanked from infancy till his 18th birthday. They could no longer spank him again. My sister was spanked until she was 8 years old. The reason that they stopped spanking her was their oldest daughter was out in the world and was learning to live amongst them. And I was talking. They were terrified Child Protective Services would come and take her away. They stopped spanking her. As I prepared to talk to all of you, I had to ask for forgiveness for my sister one last time. And she listens to me patiently, and I get done. And she says, "Bethany, you saved me. They stopped spanking when I was 8 years old. You keep forgetting that." This concludes what I'd like to share with you today. I hope that my story will contribute to stories that other people have captured. And although maybe none of you may have any inkling to follow in any sort of footsteps, but if you ever know of anybody or can share pieces of my story that will cause parents to not raise their children as I was raised, then my sharing my story will be worth it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that story. It's really incredible, and it's amazing that it's the atheists that are accused of being the ones lacking morals, when the fundamentalists and the religious are the ones that are often held up high and looked at as the ones that are to be praised, as if they are, following God's command. So we're gonna do a Q&A. That was powerful. If you guys have any questions, I'll invite them both up to answer questions to either one, and then I'll come back up and talk a little more, and we'll go to lunch. So please come back up and just watch the recording. I don't think we have a cordless mic, so if you could just repeat the questions that are answered.
Okay. There's a few questions.
Michael, do you want to select who?
Okay, well first, yeah. First of all, Bethany, I couldn't just hold you while you were reading this thing. I could see the emotion, and the emotion was coming up in me in the same exact way. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And I don't know, it's not exactly a question, but I don't know if you could ever forgive your parents, but there's no way I could. So I'll just do that. The question for Jen. Have you, in your book, do you reference the work of Phil Zimbardo and his the famous Stanford prison experiment guy? In his most recent work, he details it's kind of an overarching work for what you are dealing with. He details the very insidious nature of what Malcolm Gladwell would call the power of context. It's like, it's bigger than just the child thing. Religion, it's all grade and all, everything, our structure.
Well, I did read something recently on the prison experiment that he did. I actually went to Stanford and was friends with his son, you know, but I did learn about his experiment, as well as the work, and I'm sorry I'm not able to remember the gentleman's name that did the shock experiment. I did look into both of those things, and because it did fall in line with where I was going, but it's not something that was touching on the issue that I was wanting to expose enough that, you know, it's not part of my, I've not written about it myself, so I really can't speak to that too much in terms of how it relates to religious child maltreatment.
Milgram?
Yes, thank you. Stanley Milgram, I believe is right. Yeah, Stanley Milgram is fascinating.
Go ahead.
I'd like to ask Bethany how she left her family, where she went, and what you've done since.
Yes, I left my family at 18, and I went through a very, very big struggle trying to figure out how to function in an average life. I had some financial support from my extended family, and then I found my words asking questions, talking. I got a lot of support from various communities and have been encouraged along the way. For about 3 years in my 20s, I did not speak to my family. I was silent, and then in my late 20s, early 30s, I did start to speak to them and found going to college was a really big deal for me. I went to college when I was 29, and I learned wonderful words like socially constructed, which I wanted a poster of that. It's so awesome. And I was part of therapy, and at that point I went back to my parents and I said, I want to explain how your choices affected me. And my father was deeply, deeply moved by what he'd done, and very, very sorry, and asked for forgiveness. My mother, I am still confused as to where she's at, but I know my father, I can't handle either one of my parents physically touching me. It's not in my head. It's when they touch me, I immediately go into fear mode. And so my father does not touch me. He allows me to hug him when I want to, and he's very respectful of my space. And so I have a limited relationship with my parents that is probably as good as it's ever going to get.
I wanted to add, when I first was talking to Bethany, I asked her if she had tried to contact Roy Lessin. Can I talk about that?
Mm-hmm.
And she told me that she had, before she posted the letter. She isn't that right? Before you posted it, you sent it to him, or after you posted it?
I sent the letter to Chris Dugan, who's the owner of the website, and then I mailed it to Roy Lessin. But I did talk to Shar while I was putting together my thoughts, just to make sure I hadn't remembered incorrectly.
And Bethany told me that after she made all these efforts to get the letter to him, he did not respond. I then tried to contact Roy Lessin, and I, after sort of working through his wife on the phone, and then he did email with me directly. I asked him if he had read the letter. I sent the letter to him again by email, and he was at that point willing to not discuss the letter, but look into the possibility of being interviewed. But before he would agree to do that, he gave me a religious test, and when I didn't pass it, specifically he wanted me to say that I was giving my life over to Jesus Christ. And when I would not answer questions that had to do with any kind of religious test, he then declined to be interviewed for the book.
Bethany, thank you for your story. I was also very moved by your story. I'm curious as to if your siblings are still religious.
That's a great question. All three of my siblings are at varying levels of religious. One of my brothers is still part of what I would call the evangelical fundamental community. Not quite as extreme as the one we grew up in. My sister is in the process of finding herself and what it means to love God, and My little brother is just lost. So I don't think he affiliates with the church, but it's just lost. And I don't partake of that community at all. So.
Go ahead,
Hi, Bethany. Thank you for your story. Yeah, really interesting. Brave of you. I want to know if there's any abuse, sexual abuse involved, and why I ask that is, you say submissive position, and you have a person that is completely submissive to you. That's what you're saying. And in the library, I saw a man, a very religious man with the Bible, and he had beat his daughter. Now, in the library downtown, and she was crying on him. She's a little kid, like 3 or 4, and she's crying on his knee like this and whimpering the whole time. Now, there's something sexual and submissive about this, you know. But I want to say, not to say that every incident, I was accused unfairly of being sexual with my son, who died 19 years ago. And I have been defamed for that, even though we went to a social worker, psychiatric social worker at Kaiser on this issue, and he would have talked with my son because I was an alcoholic, but I was not. Oh, I did not take drugs. I told Bobby I took drugs, but actually it's something a little different, and you don't look different. People knew that I looked different, but you don't look different when you take drugs. So it wasn't drugs that I was taking. Anyway, I just want to say another. My sister also is a psychiatric social worker, and she says there's no truth to that at all. But I have been defamed for it, and right here. And so anyway, but I want, you know, to me there's such a submission. You're talking submission and putting a character, a child, with no power, which to me is a sexual situation. I don't know.
So your question is
do you think
a
that's a
sexual
very
component?
common situation for a religion?
The way that I answer that in my letter, open letter to Roy Lesson, my parents did not sexually abuse me in the sense of the word that people often refer to it. I do agree that spanking has a sexual component to it, and yes, it did affect me, it's something that a lot of evangelical fundamentalists will not acknowledge. So it was hard to get information, and I felt really strange for what I like to say is that pain and love were cross-wired, and it causes a lot of confusion, and it causes a lot of difficulty in being comfortable with oneself as a sexual entity. And yeah, I think that's all that I want to say. But definitely there is, and I've looked for more and more research and only found a little bit.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the author, how did you get interested in doing this book, or what, you know, were there any particular reasons that you decided to follow and pursue this topic?
It's my first book, but I've been a journalist for a pretty long time. I used to report for NPR as a freelance reporter, and I've written many nonfiction and investigative articles. And in some ways I came across this just like I would any topic that I felt was not covered sufficiently, that I also thought was a serious problem. But I think also the fact that I became a mother at the age of 41 sort of helped me become a little bit more attuned to children's issues. And it really started with my daughter attending a Montessori school, where the teachers were communicating with the children in this really cool, respectful way, and still providing boundaries and that kind of thing for the kids. And then I got into discussions that led to discussions I had with friends of mine, where I learned that most people that I knew, and was surprised by this, that they had been raised with a lot more religion than I had, and generally speaking, their experiences were largely negative. And then at the same time, there were a lot of news stories coming out, primarily child death cases with religious medical neglect. The Pope came to the United States around that time and publicly acknowledged for the first time the sexual abuse scandal. And in fact, the same week that he arrived, there were 400 plus kids that were removed from the fundamentalist Mormon sect in West Texas for concerns about underage marriage and sexual abuse. But what drove me to actually decide I would do a book was a particular case in Baltimore where a toddler was starved to death by a cult for not saying amen at meal times.
Next question in the end there.
Since your parents were so strict on discipline, and following, being, not being messy or stuff, I'm guessing that might have been involved. Are you like unconsciously rebelling against that now? Like the sense that discipline is something, like for me, because I was forced to always keep my room tidy, and I was terrified when my dad would come to my room. He wasn't a really bad person, but that statistic was like terrifying for me. Now, right now I'm a very untidy person.
How I'd answer that is as I'm clean. I'm a clean person, and I would say, and there are lots of aspects of my life where I carry phobias and fears with me to this very day. And so I found maybe not rebelling for me is not the right word, but for me I experience a lot of, I've noticed that, I'm afraid to travel, and I wonder what that's about, and spending lots of time healing through things and making myself face things I'm afraid of, and working through the deeply embedded notions that I received when I was a child. Does that make sense?
Question right here.
I'm curious as to where you stand now with respect to God and theism and all. Are you an atheist or a secularist or a humanist? How would you describe yourself?
I would describe myself as someone who, if I had to use a label, I would probably say agnostic. I'm very curious about atheist community, about free thinking, about humanists. Obviously, I used language that meant something for my old community, and I've spent a lot of time reading books and just trying to understand it. I think Buddhism is an important aspect of my healing process, and I like it because there's no God involved. And it's allowed me to become comfortable with just simply not knowing. I don't know what happens to me when I die. I'm okay with that, and there's plenty to do and think about while I'm here. It's not to say that in the future I might not decide something different, but for me, my interests are in understanding the community I came from and people who have gone from that community to other ways of thinking, more open and free ways of thinking.
And we'll go for 2 more questions, and then you guys will be available afterwards for lunch or a more in-depth discussion. So 2 more questions in the right.
I'll give my question first, and I'll give some background to frame it. I wonder if either of you or both of you would like to comment on the topic of educational neglect. The reason I asked my background, I was also raised in an evangelical fundamentalist family. I'm the oldest of my parents' 11 children. There was spanking, but nothing nearly as severe as what's been described today. But for me, I feel that the biggest damage that was done to me was in the area of education, in a mistrust of education and of science. And that was something I've had to work through on my own in my 20s. So I'm curious to hear, Bethany, about what your educational process was like. And Janet, if you have any insight from your research about a correlation between physical and psychological abuse and educational situations.
So I too am with you. It was very difficult to be 18 and have essentially a 6th grade education. My reading comprehension was high, so I did well when it came to literature and reading. I struggled with math. I struggled socially. It was very hard. I was shy anyways, and it was really hard when I would confuse Custer's Last Stand with a dessert. I didn't know. I'd never, we didn't have comprehensive history or sociology or any of that stuff. So it wasn't until I went to college, and when I graduated from Chico State, I was so proud because it was the moment where I could say, I am not ignorant, I am educated.
There are 4 forms of emotional maltreatment that I focus on: spurning, terrorizing, isolating, and exploiting. The last 2 I treat in one chapter, and essentially exploiting is when an adult tries to live their dreams or their beliefs through a child. And isolating is when you prevent the child from being exposed to, well, in this case, like mainstream beliefs, or even forming ties with or getting close to non-believers. It is like this two-step process that really feeds on each other, both exploiting and isolating at the same time, where authoritarian type sects will be able to fully control everything that the child is taught. So from our perspective, those on the outside, or whether or not we're looking at a stellar education, or even even a sort of mediocre, say, public school education, the quality in these kind of cultures is usually very poor. I was interviewing this one young man who came from an Orthodox Jewish community, and until I talked to him, I just kind of assumed that anyone who comes from a Jewish community generally is going to have a pretty good education because of the perception that that education is highly valued. He said that throughout his yeshiva and most people that he knew, he actually said to me, "You'll have to excuse me while I stumble around for the words, because I have what has been determined to be a third-grade education." And you'll find this to be true in different degrees, whether it's very, very isolated groups or even those that are in urban environments. So, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses, which those organizations usually are in urban environments, and oftentimes those kids do go to public school, but they are told that. There's the religion, there's the education that they're going to receive on the outside that they're largely to ignore, especially when it comes to anything scientific, and that what they're really to pay attention to is what's taught in the home.
And one more quick question in the back right
there. Bethany, could you tell us how long you've had to go to therapy, and have you ever recovered from the cross-wiring of the love abuse?
So I initially went to therapy when I was 19, and I went for a couple of years. They did not understand me. They did not know the language I was speaking. It was very hard. I left therapy and went back to therapy when I was 23 or 24, and they thought that I was a sexually abused victim, and they didn't remember what had happened. And that didn't work for me. So when I was 28, I went to school, and throughout the process of gender studies, history, chemistry, it was amazing. I went to therapy at that point, and I sat in the therapist chair and I said, I don't remember any sexual abuse, but let me tell you what I do remember. And that was when healing began for me. In terms of cross-wiring, it brings comfort to know that it's a very common problem with most people who experience corporal punishment, and that people deal with it in different ways. Chris Dugan on his website has a whole section dedicated to spanking fetishes, and for me personally, I assume not to. It's a part of my brain that I don't exercise. It's easier that way, and I have found in my generous and loving community lots and lots of connections, and have found new ways to experience my own sexuality that are not part of it. But the transfer is permanent, and so I will have that permanently.
Sorry, excuse me, if you have little ones, they're downstairs now, especially if you have a little 2-year-old and the other one's about. Sorry to break this up, but we're dealing with a bunch of kids who are hungry.
Just thank them.
Thanks very much. I guess are we ready? Okay.
Hold on, folks. We just have one more thing that I need to let you guys know about. So please just hold on for 1 more minute. Thank you very much.